Regularly talking about how to prevent abuse and maintain healthy boundaries is crucial for creating safe spaces for children in your community. This training is applicable to church, school, and camp settings, although many of our examples will be from churches. We often use the term faith community throughout this training to include the various settings you're coming from. We also want to name that there are victims and survivors among us, here and in every faith community. We invite you to consider how this training may affect you. If the material discussed becomes too sensitive or triggering, please feel empowered to step out or take a break so that you can identify the boundaries, self-care, and support from others that you might need. So let's get started. First, what does the Bible say about child protection? Matthew 18 tells us a lot about how to love children and about protection for children, as well as what we learn from children and why we need to protect them in their faith. In that chapter, Jesus' disciples ask him, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Then Jesus called a little child to him, and he placed the child among them, and he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Jesus doesn't say to the disciples, "Oh, we're all equal." Jesus actually brings a child into the conversation. And we know that at that time, the children's social status was only a little better than that of a slave. But Jesus loved them, and he elevated their status. Also, in Matthew 18:6, Jesus has incredibly harsh words for anyone who would harm a child. "If any of you puts a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believes in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea." Just like Jesus understood children's love and faith and humility, he elevated them. He also understood how easily they can be taken advantage of. Jesus' phrase, "little ones," in Matthew 18 is referring to children, according to the writer and advocate Victor Veith. The reference to a stumbling block could be a reference to any sin, but especially those sins that damage someone's faith. Victor says, Jesus is saying that anything we do to hurt a child's faith is viewed by God in the harshest possible terms. Some scholars assert that Jesus is especially condemning the sin of child sexual abuse in this biblical passage. Jesus didn't shy away from these topics. Child abuse has occurred during all time periods, the time of Jesus and today. The message is important for us to hear in church settings, especially since 93% of perpetrators describe themselves as religious. This is incredibly hard and painful, but it's also why you're here today watching this training. Jesus also modeled love and boundaries for all of us. He pushed against oppressive boundaries, but he never crossed or violated them. Touching women, healing on the Sabbath, relating to lepers are all examples of him pushing against societal and cultural boundaries. But his actions were about justice and not self-serving in any way. He pushed against boundaries that were oppressive and hurtful in order to bring forth justice, love, and healing. We at Dove's Nest are pro-church. We strongly believe that church and other faith communities can and should be the safest places for children, as they are our most precious resource, as Dove's Nest co-founder Jeanette Harder says. We're happy that you too believe that the church is a safe place where children can know that their entire selves are cared for by adults, but also by God. And that's important because faith communities, like churches, camps, and schools, offer so much for children and youth. You provide spiritual guidance, tangible services like meals and school supplies, social support, life skills education, lifespan celebrations, and leadership training and opportunities.
Why you should never buy colored plastic. Did you know that colored plastic is wreaking havoc on our planet?
Yes, it's hard to admit that often the biggest strengths are also weaknesses. Here's a list of strengths in faith communities that can also be weaknesses. The first one is trust. We often trust people in our faith communities, and that increases the risk of boundary crossing and abuse. Secondly, close relationships. How many times have you heard someone say, "We're like family here"? It's fantastic to have that kind of community, but let's also remember that families can have unhealthy patterns and secrets, and most abuse happens in family settings. Third is a hierarchy of power. The hierarchy of a church and organized leadership can also create issues when leadership doesn't respond to abuse or boundary crossings. It's a misuse of power to not respond appropriately. And then there's image. There can be emphasis on the faith community's image being the light of the world rather than being transparent about abuse. What about available people? Many churches and organizations, especially small ones, need people to teach Sunday school, children's church, or be youth group sponsors, camp counselors, chaperones. Faith communities are often desperate for volunteers. And there's forgiveness. Faith communities might focus on forgiveness instead of justice making, keeping individuals safe and holding accountable those who offend. Conflict avoidance. A lot of people want to avoid conflict. It's not fun. We don't want to make other people feel bad. And finally, sexuality. There's often significant discomfort or silence around sexuality and talk about our bodies in faith communities. Understanding the strengths and weaknesses in faith communities is the first step to address the complicated dynamics of child safety, boundaries, and abuse. This training video will go over 6 ways to make our faith communities safer. We'll learn more about child abuse, implement a child and youth protection policy, teach the Circle of Grace curriculum, report suspected abuse, understand social media, practice consent and healthy touch. Let's learn more about abuse. No denomination, faith group, or type of church is immune from the possibility of abuse. It's not a Catholic problem or a problem for conservative or liberals. All communities are at risk, although there are varying kinds of risks. Churches are especially at risk for sexual abuse. Let's not be paralyzed by the tragedy of child abuse, but rather be mobilized to make our faith communities the safest place for children and youth. So let's start by identifying each type of abuse so that nothing goes undetected. We often think about sexual abuse first. Faith communities are uniquely vulnerable to sexual abuse because members are close like family, as we've mentioned before. We trust each other and welcome guests. But these positive characteristics also can put kids at risk. Sexual abuse may be one of the most unreported types of abuse, and it is actually the most prevalent in churches. A second type of abuse is physical abuse. We want to keep a helpful eye for all children who might be physically abused, not only in our churches, but in our neighborhoods and communities. In particular, we need to make sure that children are not physically disciplined within our faith communities. A third type of abuse is neglect. It's the most prevalent form of abuse, accounting for over half of the children who experience abuse. Over half the children also who die from abuse have experienced neglect. What is neglect? It's not when we accidentally send our children to school without a coat or lunch money, or when we can't buy our kids name brand clothes or shoes. Neglect is when a child is at home or in a car without supervision for long periods of time, or when caregivers don't provide basic needs like food or diapers for their children, or when they fail to get their children medical treatment when they are sick or injured. And then there's emotional abuse, when a child is verbally degraded by a person who calls them names, swears at them, or ignores them. Emotional abuse can accompany other types of abuse or neglect. Like the other forms of abuse, emotional abuse is hard to detect. You can't touch it or visibly see it. So as leaders, how do you know if a child is being harmed? The best way to know if children are being abused or neglected is to watch for significant changes in behavior, like suddenly becoming more aggressive or withdrawn, or a significant change in academic performance, or regressing to an earlier developmental stage. When you see these signs, be alert, ask questions, and get involved. While there is risk for children of all ages, children the most vulnerable to sexual abuse are between the ages of 7 and 13. At Dove's Nest, we don't emphasize numbers or statistics on abuse because they can vary and only tell part of the story, but those statistics are important for us to be aware of. Every faith community has victims and survivors who are part of their fellowship. Sadly, we can assume that offenders are also part of our faith communities too. He or she may not be a registered sex offender, but they are among us because few offenders get caught. If we ignore this reality, children are at high risk for being hurt. We must accept the reality that child abuse happens, and probably not the way you'd want to believe. You see, 90% of offenders are known by the child. It may be a parent, relative, caregiver, a family friend, or someone else. So let's dispel the myth of stranger danger. An offender usually isn't the creepy guy at the park. It's more likely to be someone who is known, loved, and trusted by the child and the family. So it's important that faith communities have the same standards for those who work with kids, not embracing a stereotype for an offender. An offender can be a man or woman of any age, education level, race, or socioeconomic status. Also, having different standards of clearances and training for adult volunteers based on certain qualities, like how long we've known someone or what kind of experience they have, can get complicated, confusing, and isn't effective or fair. Let's talk about what to look for in offenders. The act of grooming is how offenders manipulate and build trust with their victims so they can abuse them. An offender often takes months, even years, gaining the trust of a child, parents, and often the whole faith community. As time goes on, they may begin showing special favors to a child or begin to find ways to be alone with the child. One reason that boundaries are so important is that offenders will often use the same kind of touch that non-offenders use to groom children, and it becomes very confusing to a child. Here are just a few signs of grooming. Appearing especially preoccupied with one child, insisting on being physical with a child, trying to be alone with a child, making inappropriate comments about a child's look or body, secrecy or lying. Being bullied or bullying others are traits that predators actually look for in children. A pattern or combination of these behaviors are those to be concerned about. However, the behaviors should not keep us from interacting with children. Kids need our love and attention. They need us to care for them and to interact with them in healthy ways. So how can we show kids that we care without touching them? We can show them through conversation and interacting with them in public places. We want to empower you to interact with kids in healthy ways, feeling confident that you aren't crossing boundaries.
Cloning a species with...
Let's talk more about the perpetrator. He or she can be an adult, a teen, or another child. Child-on-child or peer-on-peer abuse is when both the one experiencing the harm and the one doing the harm are under 18, and there is an imbalance of power among them. More than 30% of abuse is committed by kids under 18. It's important to keep this in mind when thinking about potential offenders and the myth of stranger danger. Dove's Nest is learning more and more about peer-on-peer abuse, and unfortunately, more faith communities are being confronted with it. There are different types of dynamics when dealing with minors rather than adult perpetrators. For example, many children may be sexually acting out pornography that they're exposed to. In fact, age 11 is the average age kids come across porn. So youth should not be labeled mini abusers. If the offense is addressed with safety plans and professionals, the child may be rehabilitated and the situation restored. There is hope. And yet, the damaging consequences to the victim are very real. So let's not minimize that. It's important to understand what's considered normal sexual behavior among kids so we can identify what is appropriate, inappropriate, harmful, and abusive in home, school, and church settings. Normal behaviors include curiosity that is limited, intermittent, lighthearted, and spontaneous. Problematic, or what we would call yellow light behaviors, can include exploration that is different from the child's peers. It increases over time, and it's something that the child is unable to stop. There can also be efforts to bribe or coerce children who are younger or more vulnerable. At this point, it is important that parents speak up and do something so that a safety plan and preventative measures are put in place. Sexually abusive, or what we'd call red light behaviors, are even more extreme and can include sexual behavior that is frequent, pervasive, and compulsive. It can also include types of force, manipulation, and threats, as well as provocative behavior towards adults. This is where professional intervention is absolutely needed. With all of these issues, agencies in your community can help you learn about child abuse, what to watch for, and how to report suspected child abuse. We urge you to get to know the child protection organizations in your community before you have a crisis. Build relationships with them. Talk with social workers or counselors and police in your community. If you need crisis intervention or are working with a sexual offender in your faith community, it's important to seek outside counsel. Like reporting, this is not something a faith community can usually figure out or should figure out on their own. Let's talk now about implementing, following, and regularly reviewing your child and youth protection policy. You may wonder, why do we need a protection policy at our church or organization? Well, a policy is a tangible sign of a faith community's commitment to child and youth safety. It provides common definitions as well as expectations and guidelines for appropriate behavior. It communicates that children and youth are valued. Just having a policy is a deterrent to offenders. They may see the policy and realize how hard it's going to be to have access to a child in a community that really protects them. A visible policy also signals to parents that the organization takes safety and protection seriously. That's very attractive to many parents these days. Can you think of other reasons? Jot them down. We at Dove's Nest celebrate that many churches, schools, and camps we work with now have written child protection policies. They are important to keep everyone unified regarding proper behavior and protocols, especially when faced with a tough situation. Child abuse catches organizations by surprise. It never comes at a convenient time, and it never feels good. A policy is important not only to prevent child abuse, but to navigate the times when we don't know what to do. Now I want to talk to you about Circle of Grace. The Circle of Grace curriculum is most often used in Christian schools or in Sunday schools, and it's an important tool for empowering children. It should be used after creating a child protection policy and training adults. Dove's Nest believes it's the adult's responsibility to keep kids safe through protection policies, training, bystander intervention, and general education on abuse prevention. It's not up to children. So let me tell you a little bit more about Circle of Grace. It's a Christian curriculum on healthy boundaries and abuse prevention that educates children and youth about the value of positive relationships with God and others. It's a comprehensive pre-kindergarten through 12th grade curriculum designed to fit any Christian education program. It has 1 to 4 lessons per grade and can be done in less than a month. It's best taught yearly and can be done in many settings, and is available in Spanish and English. Circle of Grace is developmentally appropriate and empowers kids to identify and maintain appropriate physical, emotional, spiritual, and sexual boundaries. The Archdiocese of Omaha developed the curriculum, and Dove's Nest offers a Protestant version for churches, schools, and camps. We want kids to know that God and adults in the faith community care about their well-being and that their bodies are respected. Circle of Grace helps children identify potential violations by listening to their gut and the Holy Spirit so that they can seek help before they're harmed. Here's a brief overview of what the curriculum includes. God helps children know what belongs or doesn't belong in their circle of grace. A child recognizes an uncomfortable feeling through a funny feeling that is in their gut. And then he or she realizes that this may be the Holy Spirit's prompting. And then they seek help from a trusted adult. Finally, Circle of Grace enables Sunday school teachers and youth leaders to demonstrate that no topic is off limits. One time, a friend told me a story. A child started telling her about something that they had seen on TV that made the child feel uncomfortable. When they used the word sex, another child elbowed them and said, "We don't talk about that in church." My friend was able to reinforce that they could talk with her about anything because their faith community cares about all parts of their lives. Circle of Grace gave them a common language. Now, I need to talk to you about reporting any suspected child abuse. Any and all suspected abuse needs to be reported to your local authorities. Follow your church or organization's policy regarding this. When hearing a child tell about abuse, first of all, believe them. You may be the only person that that child discloses to. How you respond has a big effect on how the child heals from the abuse. If you shut them down, or perhaps he or she will never share again. Remember to listen and avoid giving advice, making promises, or making assumptions. Also, don't interrogate or ask leading questions or ask for details. Instead, limit the questions to the following. What happened? When did it happen? Where did it happen? Who did it? And how do you know them? As a person hearing about the abuse, you don't need proof or evidence. If you have suspicion, or a child discloses, or you observe disturbing patterns, you must report. All of your identifying information will be kept confidential. While false reports have happened, they are very rare, and they often indicate there is something else that is going on that needs addressed by a faith community. Perhaps past abuse, or something going on in the child's life that needs attention. Dove's Nest recommends that everyone act as a mandated reporter, regardless of your profession or what state you live in. After you've made the report, contact the pastoral team or someone in your church's Safe Church Committee if you have one, or reach out to another organizational leader. Here's where you'll need to follow your organization's child protection policy. Also, childhelp.org and the National Hotline is a resource you can utilize while reporting child abuse. Dove's Nest is also a resource for your faith community's leadership. Let's talk about social media safety. Tackling the challenges of technology and social media is hard. It's constantly changing, and adults may often feel like we can't keep up. But tech is here to stay, so we need to find safe ways to make it work for us and our faith communities. Safety really starts at home, making sure that those of you who are parents have open communication with your teens about what they're doing online, in their gaming, in their conversations. You can't monitor every move, but you can help them set boundaries. One example might be for everyone in the family putting their phones in the kitchen at nighttime, with you as parents being the models doing that. As I said earlier, when it comes to tech, such as how you communicate with your youth group, Facebook pages, group texts, they're here to stay. Many youth leaders use these technologies to communicate with kids. It's become normal for us. While we at Dove's Nest are not the expert on social media safety, we can have some best practices for you to think about for your faith communities. Here are a few. Limit one-to-one electronic communication. Just like we avoid one-on-one connection with kids in real life, we want to follow the same two-adult rule in technology. Also, copy parents or other adults on emails or text messages. Keep parents apprised of what's going on or phone conversations that are happening with youth. Communication should be traceable, which also protects you. Also consider whether you should friend a child or youth that you're working with on social media. Some camps have guidelines about when counselors can friend campers. Similar guidelines often apply to teachers and students. When you're in doubt whether you should friend a child or not, probably don't. Nothing is confidential. This is something kids need to know also. And talk with other adults you're working with when you have questions. So now we're going to talk about healthy touch and consent. We all want children to know that they are made in the image and likeness of God, and that sexuality is a gift. We can model respect for their bodies by not touching someone without their permission, by not objectifying others, and by calling out unfairness when people are objectified. We as adults can model by using positive language, boundary words, and reinforcing boundaries between kids. In addition, it would be great if we as adults could model consent better for kids. Examples of this are asking permission before laying hands on someone for prayer, or giving opt-out options for intimate rituals like foot washing, or different ways of accepting and anointing. Practicing consent as adults is important too, so we as grown-ups should also ask before giving a hug. Trust your instincts concerning consent. If you have doubts, listen to them. Your body often knows what your head hasn't quite yet figured out. Talk to a faith community leader or other resource person when you have concerns about someone who isn't respecting boundaries of kids or other adults. We as adults should speak up if something is odd or feels off. The Circle of Grace curriculum helps children do all of this by paying attention to their gut feelings and seeking help. Adults need to do that as well. People of all ages should talk about and practice consent. So you might be wondering, what really is consent? First, consent is a clear yes, not an absence of no. Second is voluntary and should be verbal. It's always best to ask children of all ages, do you want a hug? Third, consent is a process and conversation. For example, I see you're tickling him, but he's saying stop. Even if he's laughing, he is saying stop. Or, can you hear that? Are you in his circle of grace? This doesn't look like a safe touch. Or, more generally, he looks like he could use some space right now. Let's everyone just take one step back and make sure to respect each other's personal space. Finally, consent can always be withdrawn. It's not fair to say to a child, oh, but you gave me a hug last Sunday, why not today? Or, I thought you liked to sit with me in church. A child's verbal or nonverbal no should always be respected. Another friend of mine was volunteering as the second adult in her nursery. And while she was sitting on the floor with her daughter, her daughter hugged her. And another little girl was looking a bit sad, looking over at them. And so my friend said to the little girl, would you like a hug too? My friend tried to keep her hands back so it wasn't pressuring her. She said, no, I don't. My friend was so glad that she asked because she made the wrong assumption about the young girl and what she needed and wanted. Now, let's look at healthy touch, unhealthy touch, and confusing touch. Healthy touch. Children need love, encouragement, both physical and emotional safety. Healthy touch is in response to a child's need for comfort, encouragement, or affection. It should not be based on an adult's emotional need. Babies and toddlers need physical touch. Being held and cared for are things that they innately need. For older children, offer the option of high fives, side hugs, pats on the shoulder, or fist bumps. Perhaps you have friends and family members who insist on touching your children. For them, you can say, we have a family rule that our son doesn't have to hug or kiss, or even high five someone if he doesn't want to. Prior to touch, though, engaging in conversation is probably the best way to make kids feel appreciated. A study shows that the #1 thing youth want from church is someone who listens to them and talks with them in a caring way. So let's look at what is considered unhealthy touch. Unhealthy touch makes the receiver feel bad about himself or herself. It's received as painful, manipulative, coercive, abusive, or frightening. Of course, we want to avoid all kinds of unhealthy bad touch. Unhealthy touch can be abusive and needs to be reported. Or it can be unwanted touch that should be intervened and corrected. Also in this category, we need to instruct everyone working with kids that no type of physical discipline, like hitting or spanking, is ever permitted. And then there's the confusing touch. Confusing touch makes the receiver feel uneasy, confused, or unsure. They'll have conflicting feelings about the touch or the person doing the touching. A lot of touch is confusing, especially for older kids. Puberty makes so many things feel awkward. The receiver might experience conflicting feelings about the touch or the person doing the touching. Sometimes adults will reach out and touch kids or put their arms around them or scoop them up or give them a hug or a kiss. It could be harmful or it could simply be awkward and not age appropriate. I've heard youth groups say, "We're a huggy group." What does that mean for someone who doesn't want to be hugged? We pressure people to touch or be touched more than we realize. We need to make sure that we don't send the message that here in church or elsewhere, we're nice and not rude. Rather, we need to respect children and youth when they don't want to be touched or touch someone else. Many of the kids who show indiscriminate friendliness are also the ones who need kind and unhealthy boundaries the most. We don't sit on laps during circle time, but I'd love for you to sit beside me as someone with something that you can say to a child who wants to crawl into your lap.
They're called bionic boomers, seniors once riddled with debilitating arthritis pain.
While talking about physical touch, it's important that we also talk about power. This includes male-female dynamics, age dynamics, group pressure, and Jesus' vision of mutual love and serving relationships. Some reminders for all of us. Power is not about if you feel powerful or not. Power is neutral and objective. You have power if you're older, bigger, stronger, have normal development. If you're sober, all of those things give you power over an adult or child who does not. If you have more power, your obligations around consent are different. Here's an example of touch guidelines from one faith community. The first one is that appropriate touch should be a response to the child's need for comfort, encouragement, or affection. It should not be based on the adult's emotional needs. Their second one is to never force affection on any child. Physical contact should always be with the child's consent. For example, the approved adult may ask, "May I give you a hug?" The third one is that physical touch should generally be limited to hugs and contact with the child's hand, shoulder, or upper back. A child's verbal or nonverbal no should always be respected. At no time should a child or youth, even if fully clothed, be touched on or near the breasts, genitals, or buttocks. Physical touch should be appropriate for the age of the child or youth. For example, while it is often appropriate to hold a toddler on your lap, it is inappropriate for a teenager to sit on the lap of an adult. For older youth, they could opt for a side hug or other form of affection that does not involve excessive contact. Physical affection toward a child or youth should occur while another adult is present, and corporal punishment is never permitted. Finally, I want to go over some general ways to be more safe. First, decrease isolation and secrecy. Increase supervision and accountability. All activities should be observable and interruptible. Provide education on personal, emotional, and physical boundaries and on appropriate touch. Finally, follow the two-adult rule. It's important for one adult never to be alone with a child. It's also best to avoid one adult with multiple children, although that's better than one-on-one. We recommend 2 approved adults in every activity for children or youth. Thank you for participating in this training. We are so grateful that you're working with kids, either as paid staff or volunteers. The time, energy, and resources you give go a long way for the lives of kids. Please don't underestimate that. So to recap, in this
push the magic button. There's a sign-in going around just to have a record of who is here. Dove's Nest that created this video originally does no longer exist, but their resources are now under the umbrella of Mennonite Church USA, and that's a place that you can find a lot of resources and different kinds of support. So, you know, I expect a lot of things in the video are things that we've heard before, but good to be reminded. And one of the things I especially think about, you know, she talks about some of the things in church that we love the most are also the things that make churches vulnerable to having abuse happen. The fact that we're trusting, that we need volunteers, all of those things. And so I really appreciate you all taking the time to be here and make sure that those of us working with children and youth are helping to keep them as safe as possible and know what to do when we suspect that children are being harmed in any way. Are there any, before we talk about some specific things with this congregation, were there any observations or questions that anyone had from the video? So the Bethel College Mennonite Church policy, there's copies in the office. I have a few extra copies here. It's available online. I know a lot of you worked really hard to make this happen. It is, the committee is reviewing it this year. So as you read through it, if there are things you notice that you have questions about, that you think could be more clear, or that you think need to be changed, let me or someone on the committee know, send your suggestions in, because we'll be working to update it. It will have been about 5 years, I think, and it's always the kind of document that's good to refresh. One change that's already in place, that's what we call it, a provisional change, for the nursery, rather than the 2 adults, they're changing the policy to allow for 1 trained adult and 1 trained youth to be in the nursery, because the youth help a lot, and particularly because it is such a visible space that it seems appropriate to allow that change. So that's an example of some of the things that we're thinking about and changing. In terms of, where did my notes go? So for volunteering, what you all need to do is have been involved in the church for at least 6 months. I don't know if you have or not, because I haven't been yet, but to read the policy, which I expect many of you have done, but it's very available for those who need to go through it. To participate in this training and have your name on the paper that's going around so we know that you've participated. Fill out a volunteer registration form, which is a one-time thing, and if you haven't done that yet, I do have some copies of it that you can fill out, and to sign the Abuse Prevention Covenant, which happens each year, just a reaffirmation of your understanding and commitment to following the guidelines. To have a background check, and the frequency of that is something we're talking about right now, but at this point, I think if you've had one, you're good to go. I think it'll probably end up being every 3 or 4 years to do that. And be at least 5 years older than those that you're volunteering to help. So not to make growth assumptions about how old you all are, but I don't think that's I don't think any of us in this room are going to have trouble with that guideline. That's more for the youth, so you don't have a 12-year-old helping with, a 10-year-old in the classroom or whatever, have a little bit of an age gap there, but that guideline is more for youth. Yeah, so I have all of the forms up here, if you need any of them, copies of the policy. Are there any questions, or those of you who have been around longer and know this a little better than me, anything that I'm forgetting in terms of the training today. And if you have, as you go and work with the kids and youth, if things come up that you think, oh, it'd be really nice to learn about this, let us know, because we can, tailor different trainings to different aspects as we go. I started with this very basic one because it's available, and why reinvent the wheel, and make sure we're all starting out with a good baseline. But we can definitely explore some other aspects, and don't hesitate to reach out if specific situations come up. You create these nice policies, and then life happens and things don't fit exactly in the boxes. And so that's what we're a community for, to help each other figure things out. So please reach out if anything comes up. If there's no questions, I will close us in prayer. God of love, we thank you for the privilege it is to be part of your church, for the joy that children and youth bring to our community, and the precious responsibility to offer care in your name to them in this church. Give us the energy and the wisdom that we need to serve you well by caring for them well, and let us find joy in being a part of this service. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all so much. And I'm actually going to take the papers to the table in the back, because it'll be a lot easier for you to sign them on that table than on this machine bench.